An unfamiliar loud roar rings out over occupied Paris. In downtown cafés, world-weary locals abruptly set down their coffee cups and look up from their newspapers. In 2 painful years of Nazi occupation, they've been forced to get used to the irritating whine of Messerschmitts and Junkers. But this sounds totally different, something they'd never heard before, and it sounds alarmingly close. Rushing outside, they shield their eyes from the sun as they look up. Barely 30 feet over their heads, a lone aircraft is hurtling through the Swastika-lined city streets toward the Arc de Triomphe. The Parisians exchange puzzled looks. Perhaps this is a new Luftwaffe aircraft suffering from mechanical issues. Yet, as they squint harder, they notice the markings on the aircraft's fuselage. And when they do, they can hardly believe their eyes. Background. In the dark spring of 1942, Paris bore little resemblance to its pre-war glory. After nearly 2 years of occupation, the City of Light had been transformed into a symbol of Nazi dominance, its elegant boulevards now draped with swastika banners, its street signs rewritten in German. While Parisians moved about in makeshift handcarts due to strict fuel rationing, German officers cruised the streets in gleaming Mercedes and Daimlers, flaunting their power. Adding insult to injury, every day at precisely 12:15 p.m., the Wehrmacht would stage an elaborate parade down the Champs-Élysées, Paris's main Grand Avenue. Like clockwork, the relentless sound of thunderous German jackboots in military bands would echo through the streets as long gray columns of soldiers marched toward the Arc de Triomphe, France's most revered military monument. Their choice of destination was no coincidence. It was a calculated display of superiority, deliberately chosen to rub the French people's face in their defeat and break their patriotic spirit. Yet among the café patrons feigning disinterest in these daily demonstrations of Nazi might, outrage was quietly burning. Behind their cautiously neutral facial expressions, dangerously defiant ideas were beginning to stir. They couldn't simply sit back and allow the Germans to continue with their arrogant behavior. Something had to be done to teach them a lesson. The regularity of the Wehrmacht parade had not been lost on the French resistance. Every single day, they saw the exact same performance. The same route, the same formations, the same timings. While intended as a show of strength, resistance agents started to wonder if the parade's predictability could actually be a weakness, one that could be exploited to devastating effect. With the Gestapo watching their every move, it would be difficult for the French to do anything themselves. But if they were able to provide their British allies with the necessary intelligence, they might just be able to set the stage for a humiliating blow to Nazi pride. Sure enough, information about the parade had reached Major Ben Cowburn of the Special Operations Executive, the secret British organization responsible for espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance behind enemy lines. He, in turn, passed the details on to the head of Royal Air Force Coastal Command, Air Marshal Philippe Joubert de la Ferté. Partly of French descent himself, Joubert saw an opportunity for the RAF to not only disrupt the parade, but to create a daring symbol of Allied unity and refusal to bow down to German oppression. The men for the job. The mission he had in mind would be incredibly dangerous. It would require a crew capable of precise low-level flying and navigation through heavily defended airspace. More importantly, they would need the courage to fly alone into the heart of occupied France. Joubert turned to the 236 Squadron. The unit's Latin motto, Speulati Nuntiate, translated as having watched, bring word, appropriate for the task ahead. What's more, he knew just the man for the job, Flight Lieutenant Alfred Can Gatward. Gatward, a handsome, light-haired 27-year-old, was a former journalist who had joined the RAF Volunteer Reserve in 1937. During the evacuation of Dunkirk in May and June 1940, he demonstrated remarkable skill and aggression in low-level attacks on German positions, exactly what Joubert was looking for. Joubert summoned Gatward to Coastal Command headquarters, along with his navigator, Sergeant Gilbert George Fern, a former arts and crafts and woodwork teacher. The Air Marshal simply asked the men if they would be interested in taking on a special assignment, warning them, quote, "I'm afraid it's not very safe." Gatward's curiosity was sparked, but Joubert refused to give him more details until the pilot would confirm his participation. Without hesitation, Gatward accepted the mysterious mission. However, he also reminded the Air Marshal that Fern was a married man, and would probably not be interested in such a risky operation, only for Fern to chime in, quote, "Oh yes, I am." The plan. With Gatward and Fern confirming their commitment, Joubert could finally reveal his audacious plan. Not only were they to fly down the Champs-Élysées to strafe the daily German parade, they were also to attack the German High Command headquarters at the Ministère de la Marine building in the Place de la Concorde. But Joubert and his mission planners had one more dramatic addition, one that would transform a straightforward military raid into something far more powerful. From Portsmouth Harbor, they acquired a large French tricolor flag. The idea was simple but effective. They would cut the flag in half horizontally, add weights to ensure they would unfurl properly, and drop them during the raid. One would fall on the Arc de Triomphe and the other on the Ministère de la Marine, inspiring hope among the French people and sending a poignant reminder that they had not been forgotten. The aircraft chosen for the mission was the Bristol Beaufighter, a powerful fighter bomber famously described as, quote, "a fuselage in hot pursuit of two engines." Using a specialized version was ruled out for fears of advanced technology falling into German hands, so a regular model was chosen instead. Throughout May 1942, Gatward and Fern began intensive training for what was now codenamed Operation Squabble. They practiced extreme low-level flying, honing their accuracy with cannons by attacking a shipwreck in the English Channel. By early June, they were ready. The plan called for them to rely on cloud cover for protection, flying the entire route above the clouds before descending near Paris for the attack. Flying from RAF Thorney Island near Portsmouth, Gatward and Fern headed for occupied France. Yet, as they approached the coast, they faced a critical problem. There wasn't enough cloud cover to mask their approach. Bound by their orders, they had no choice but to turn back. In the days that followed, 2 more attempts met the same fate. With summer fast approaching, the skies over France continued to clear. It began to look as though Operation Squabble might never happen. But Gatward and Fern weren't about to let the mission of a lifetime slip away. Without official approval, they made a bold decision. If they couldn't rely on the clouds, they would fly the entire route at extremely low level, using the terrain itself to protect them. Squabble gets underway. On June 12th, they made their move, taking off from Thorney Island at 11:29 a.m. At first, it seemed they would have cloud cover after all, the gray skies lashing down heavy rain. Yet, as they approached the French coast near Fécamp around half an hour later, the clouds began to thin. By the time they reached Rouen, bright sunshine had broken through. Though this meant they would now be clearly visible to enemy defenses, they pressed on, carefully keeping their Beaufighter just 30 feet off the ground. Their luck was tested almost immediately. A startled crow smashed into the Beaufighter's oil cooler, causing the temperature gauge to spike and the oil pressure to fluctuate erratically. But there was no turning back now. They pressed on toward Paris, the Beaufighter's powerful twin engines thundering as they raced over the French countryside. Flying so low they were spooking horses in the fields, Gatward and Fern covered the miles with painstaking precision. Navigation at such low altitude was exceptionally challenging, but after 30 miles, they finally spotted a telltale sign that they were nearing their destination. The unmistakable silhouette of the Eiffel Tower, rising stark against the horizon. As they approached the outskirts of Paris, they encountered their first resistance as light anti-aircraft fire peppered the sky around them. Gatward kept the Beaufighter low, using its speed and the element of surprise to their advantage. At 12:27 p.m., they reached the city. Now came the most dangerous part of their mission, penetrating the heart of Europe's largest Nazi-occupied metropolis. Gatward's hands tightened around the controls as they approached the city center. Every movement of the aircraft now requiring absolute precision as they navigated through the maze of grand boulevards and historic architecture. German anti-aircraft positions dotted the city's rooftops, any one of them able to end their mission in an instant. Peril over Paris. Gatward and Fern were able to zoom past the enemy defenses unscathed. Banking hard around the Eiffel Tower, Gatward saw their first target looming ahead, the Arc de Triomphe. By now, many Parisians had spotted the low-flying aircraft, and recognizing its RAF roundels, began waving and cheering. Gatward flew to the west of the huge monument, before breaking into a turn to bring them directly above it. From this perfect position, Fern was able to drop the first French flag. With no time to wait and watch the flag unfurl, Gatward and Fern headed straight for the Champs-Élysées to wreak havoc on the parade. But as they roared down the famous tree-lined avenue, they suddenly realized something was amiss. The German army hadn't shown up. Despite the French resistance agents having observed the Wehrmacht march at the same time every day for months, on this particular day, they were not there. It seems doubtful that the Germans had known they were coming, or they would have been stopped. An intelligence error regarding the timing was equally unlikely, given the regularity of the parade. Perhaps it was just an unfortunate coincidence that on the one day Gatward and Fern flew over Paris, for some reason, the Nazi spectacle was delayed or cancelled. Despite their disappointment at missing the chance to strafe the Wehrmacht, the two British airmen were not about to turn around and go home. They still had another target to attack, the German High Command headquarters at the Ministère de la Marine, and Fern still had the other tricolore in the Beaufighter's flare chute. As he and Gatward raced down the Champs-Élysées, barely skimming the treetops, the navigator took the opportunity to grab his reconnaissance camera and take a few photos, including one of the Grand Palais, announcing its rather ironically named pro-Nazi exhibition, La Vie Nouvelle, the New Life. In total, he managed to take 61 photographs documenting the raid, proof that would soon expose the vulnerability of Hitler's supposedly impregnable fortress in Europe. Approaching the eastern end of the avenue, he and Gatward identified the Ministère de la Marine to their left. After quickly scanning the entrance to ensure there were no innocent civilians in the way, Gatward took his chance to unleash a solid blast of gunfire from the Beaufighter's 20mm cannons that sent the terrified Germans scrambling for cover. As the soldiers fought to catch their breath, barely able to believe what had just happened, Fern topped off the attack by letting the second flag fall right over the Ministère de la Marine. Parisians of all types came rushing out of nearby shops and cafés to witness the incredible sight, smiling and applauding Gatward and Fern's inspiring act of defiance. Paris might still have been under the Nazi jackboot, but for that brief moment, the French people were reacquainted with a feeling they hadn't felt in 2 long years: hope. The escape. Having struck their blow against German pride, Gatward and Fern now faced their final challenge: escaping from the most heavily defended city in occupied Europe. As the Beaufighter raced north, the two-man crew braced themselves for action, all too aware that within seconds, the Germans would have alerted every anti-aircraft battery in the city, and perhaps worse still, the Luftwaffe. Keeping the aircraft as low to the ground as possible, as they zipped past the spires of St. Augustine's Church and the Saint-Lazare train station, Gatward pushed its throttles to their limits, determined to avoid German flak. Following the same route they had used on their way in, they made their break for the coast. Meanwhile, the damage from their avian encounter earlier that day was still causing problems. The crew's remains in the starboard oil cooler had sent temperatures soaring, and now they faced a new challenge. Their windscreen was becoming increasingly obscured by the countless insects they were hitting at such low altitude. Through it all, Gatward maintained their breakneck pace, knowing that every second over occupied territory increased their chances of interception. At 12:55 p.m., they crossed back over the French coast, just north of where they had entered barely an hour before. Fern gave Gatward a new course for RAF Northolt in London, where they touched down at 1:53 p.m. Their mission complete. The crow that had very nearly derailed the entire operation was removed from the oil cooler and ceremonially laid to rest at the airfield as the raid's only casualty. Back in Paris, the German High Command was already trying to contain the propaganda damage. They put out a story claiming that one of their own aircraft had experienced mechanical trouble and was responsible for the low-level flying over the city. But the Parisian people would not forget the tremendous sight of the RAF Beaufighter and the French flags that had dropped over their city that day. In any case, any hopes the Nazi leadership may have had of covering up the incident were ruined 8 weeks later when Fern's photographs were published in Life magazine, showing the world that the Allies could strike at will, even in the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. Squabble's legacy. For a mission codenamed after a minor quarrel, Operation Squabble's impact was anything but trivial. While no significant military targets were destroyed and no enemy troops eliminated, the raid had achieved perhaps something even more valuable. A major morale booster for all of occupied Europe, that demonstrated the power of Allied solidarity while wiping the smug smiles off the Nazis' faces. For his courageous performance at the controls of the Beaufighter, Gatward was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was also presented with a magnum of champagne in a special presentation case by the French government as a token of their gratitude for carrying out such a daring raid. After a stint as personal assistant to the governor of Gibraltar, he took command of the Royal Canadian Air Force's 404 Squadron, leading anti-shipping operations in the waters off Scotland, and rising to the rank of wing commander by the end of the war. Meanwhile, as a non-commissioned officer, Fern was mentioned in dispatches and awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal. He was also given a commission, becoming a squadron leader by the time the conflict came to a close, before returning to his pre-war job as a teacher.